All right, so exam 1 will cover chapters 19, 21, and 22. If you go under Lecture Lab Weekly, you'll see the exam 1 review folder. You can find everything in Module 1 and Module 2 folders. Here you'll see the possible written exam questions for each chapter, both in Word and PDF. You have this exam 1 multiple choice practice test. Each time you take it, you'll be presented with 51 of the multiple choice questions, but there's over 160 questions in the test bank. So you will see many of the questions, but maybe not all of the questions that are going to be on the exam. I will only choose around 40 of them to be on the exam. You can also use these Kahoot links if you like playing the Kahoots for each chapter. So when you open each of the possible exam questions, you'll see the list. You can find all of the answers. You can find most of it in the slides, but you may need to go into the text for more detail. And so all you have to do is come into here. You can use the search. Type in fossils for that first one, and it'll tell you where it's going to be. You can see right here 7 results in chapter 19, but it's mentioned several different places, and so this will take you right to the place in the text that'll get you the answer. And so with the fossils, you can find it in figure 19.3, and it is on page 386. So here is the area in the text talking about fossils that will give you the information you need to answer this question. And then what is evolution? You can find that under concept 19.2, pages 388 to 389. With what is artificial selection? And the next question, what are some examples of artificial selection? All the examples aren't in the text, but you can find those on page 391 in figure 1910. And we talked about examples that aren't shown in the text. The one in the text is the one that shows you the broccoli, how mustard seed evolved. And so again, you can just type in artificial selection. And like I said, oh, I must have spelled it wrong. Artificial selection. And so it'll bring you again to 19, like I said, figure 1910 goes into artificial selection, and that's the one with the mustard seed and the broccoli and the kale and the things that have been derived. Other examples that we talked about during lecture were dogs, cats, crops, more muscle mass on our animals that we consume. So all of those we've done to give us a selective advantage to produce more product with fewer input. And then 5, what are some of the three main ideas of natural selection? Again, you can find those figure 19.3 and on page 392. So look there, that'll give you the answers for that. And then what are examples that were given as evidence of natural selection? The biggest one are Darwin's finches, which we saw back up here. In chapter 22, we mentioned the flightless birds that they found in Galapagos, the tortoises. Another very classic example of natural selection are the moths. I think I mentioned the moths in England, and they're the peppered moths. So you can do a quick search, find something on the peppered moths. And during the Industrial Revolution, they evolved to a darker color to blend in with the soot. Now that everything's been cleaned up, they're actually evolving back into white because things aren't as dirty. So those are some of the classic examples with evidence of natural selection. And then what are 4 types of scientific evidence to support the theory of evolution? You can find these under Concept 19.3, pages 393 and 396. Fossils, homologies, direct observation. You can see evolution happening now. And so those are all ways in which we have seen natural selection. Oh, and then biogeography was the 4th thing in there. So you've got direct observation, you've got the homologies, you've got the fossils, and then you have the biogeographic patterns that we talked about from when Pangea had existed and then the continents drifted apart. And then what are some current day observations? So those are the soapberry bugs. And then the antibiotic resistant microbes that are coming are 2 of our current day evolutionary things. So if you go to where you see the soapberry bugs, and that was with the length of their beak. So that was figure 1914. And then with our multi-drug resistant MRSA right here, the evolution of drug resistant bacteria is another, so figure 1915. And then with our anatomical evidence, these are our homologous structures. So here are homologous structures, vestigial structures, anatomical similarities between our embryos are all examples of what types of anatomical evidence exist for evolution. So homologous, vestigial, and embryonic are all evidence, anatomical evidence for evolution. And then what is convergent evolution? That's where we talked about the flying squirrels and the sugar gliders, flying squirrels in America and the sugar gliders in Australia. So that's figure 1918, page 396. So that's all of chapter 19. Move on to chapter 21. And define microevolution and the 3 main mechanisms that cause it. You can find that at the beginning of chapter 21, right on the first page of chapter 21. You can see, and you can come into our table of contents, chapter 21. That very first page gives us the microevolution right there. And right there is your definition of microevolution. And then what are things that lead to microevolution? The biggest thing, natural selection, then genetic drift and gene flow. And so genetic drift and gene flow covered in more detail as we get into the chapter. And then what is genetic variation, and describe the sources of genetic variation. You can find that on pages 422 to 423. So mutation, there's your genetic variation, there's the definition, and then you move through sources of genetic variation, formation of new alleles due to mutation, so mutation, and then altering gene number or position, so chromosomal mutation or rearrangement, rapid reproduction, sexual reproduction. Remember, with sexual reproduction, we have the crossing over in meiosis 1, we have random alignment in meiosis 1, and then we have random fertilization. And if you need a review of that, here is a video within your chapter that will give you the causes of variation. And remember, pay attention to these point values. When I want 5 points, you need to give me more than just a sentence. You need to give me some detail. And when I say describe, describe does not mean list. Describe means describe. And then define, population, gene pool, allele. You'll find those in the next section of chapter 21 on page 424. And then what is natural selection and how does it occur? We talk about this almost in every chapter. And so pages 428 to 429 will give you those answers. What is genetic drift and describe? And what are two primary examples? That was our bottleneck effect and the founder effect. So again, if you want to put that in, and that's on what, page 428. So we'll go to 428. And here you get into natural selection, genetic drift, founder effect. And a common example of our founder effect is right here, British colonists back in 1814. Settlement on an island between Africa and South America. Apparently one of the colonists contained a recessive allele for retinitis pigmentosa. So of the 240 descendants on the island in the late 1960s, 4 had that, and that was a high frequency allele, 10 times higher than the normal population. So there's an example of a founder effect in the human population. And then bottleneck effect, that's when you have a rapid decrease in the population. Our prairie chicks were one of the things that we looked at with genetic drift and the bottleneck effect. And so things that really lead to genetic drift are the small populations, and that drift can cause allele frequencies to change at random, genetic variation within populations, and then the harmful alleles become fixed because the population got so small. And so here is your genetic drift in a summary, page 430, just what I mentioned. And what is gene flow? And that's when alleles come in and out. The example we talked about were the snakes. And so gene flow, local adaptations on the Lake Erie water snake, and how the banding pattern never eliminated from any population, but is lower in some populations where it's not a selective advantage. And then definition of relative fitness on page 431. Describe the 3 main modes of natural selection. And here's a little video if you want to watch natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow within your text. So most of these videos that we watch or I show, you can find within the text also. And so here are our 3 examples of natural selection: directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. And again, make sure you describe, do not just list if you want full credit for that. And that's figure 2113. And then the sickle cell we did in lab, and there is also a large story of that in your text that you can find with our balancing selection. That's the heterozygous advantage, figure 2115. And then the frequency selection are the left and right mouthed fish, which you'll see on page 436. And there was our allele with the malaria, the heterozygous advantage. And then here is the frequency dependent selection with our scale eating fish, left and right mouth. And then why does natural selection not create the perfect organism? And it's because our environments are always changing. And you have a little list in here as to why Selection can act only on existing variations. Evolution limited to historical constraints. Adaptations are often compromises, not the best always. And natural selection is chance, and the environment interact, and the environment is constantly changing. So these are the 4 reasons why natural selection does not always create the perfect organism. And there you go with your chapter 21 questions. And then last but not least, chapter 22, and you can find these. Number 1, biological species concepts. As soon as you go into that chapter, page 441, figure 22.2. Definition of 2 kinds of reproductive isolating mechanisms. And don't give me just prezygotic and postzygotic. That will not get you full credit. You need to give me examples, all 5 examples of the prezygotics, all 3 examples of the postzygotic. That's 8 points. 5 and 3 equal 8. So you need to give me all 8 of those if you want full credit for that question. And you can find that in figure 22.3, a nice summary that is on page 442 and 443 of your text. Oop. That ain't going right, did it? 442. Oh. Oh. Alright. Is it? I think it was. Alright. Let me try this again. So 440, 441, and then there's the 442. So figure 22.3. So all 5 of the prezygotic and the 3 postzygotic. So you got to list them out if you want full credit. And then question 3, compare and contrast sympatric and allopatric. And so that is same country, different country. The allopatric, you actually physically have a physical barrier. Sympatric, you do not. Allopatric, figure 22.6, 22.7, and 22.8. And then sympatric, you're going to see in figures 22.9, 22.10, and 22.11. And you need to give the ways in which sympatric can happen. Allopatric happens much more rapidly, more common, but sympatric, the polyploidies. And so I showed you that video in the lecture I recorded, and I'm sure it's in the text too. So if you come in here and then look at the polyploidy with the sympatric, and so there are the figures that show it, and here's that video, mechanisms of alyploidy and autoploidy. And then also adaptation to local environments, and then sexual selection, figure 22.12 with the Chicadid's fish as an example. And then there's another, speciation changes and polyploidy. But again, you don't need to give me a ton of detail, just list those 3 and a brief explanation of each. Those examples of allopatric speciation and when it occurs. And then question 4, differentiate between 2 major concepts. And so this is gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium for question 4. Gradualism versus punctuated. All right, so there is a quick review, although it's not that quick. Looks like it ended up being 20 minutes. If you have any questions, be sure to email me, let me know. I'll be glad to try and help point you in the right direction. Have a good evening, and I will see you Thursday.